She watched them from her bay window every single day, ledger in hand, documenting their every move like they were fugitives. Eleanor Sterling was the self-appointed empress of the Whispering Pines estates, and she was convinced the new identical twins next door didn't belong. She thought she held all the power. She thought one urgent call to the precinct would shatter their lives forever. But when the blue and red lights finally arrived, Eleanor didn't realize she wasn't summoning her personal security detail. She was summoning their matriarch. And she wasn't just a mother, she was the newly appointed Commissioner of Public Safety, and she knew exactly what Eleanor had been hiding in her cellar for 2 decades. Settle in. You are not ready for this climax. The moving van was the initial provocation. It was a Wednesday, a day when the residents of Whispering Pines were supposed to be engaged at work or meticulously grooming their manicured hedges, not obstructing the cul-de-sac with a behemoth of a truck labeled Atlas Movers. Eleanor Sterling stood behind her bespoke silk drapes at 12 Serenity Lane, her knuckles white as she gripped her vintage teacup. She didn't sip the tea. She just held it as an accessory for her morning surveillance. Whispering Pines was her dominion. She had been the head of the Property Owners Collective for 18 consecutive years, primarily because no one else dared to challenge her, or perhaps because the last person who did found their water utility bills mysteriously doubled a week later. Observe that, Eleanor muttered to the empty library. The atmosphere in her residence was pristine, smelling faintly of potpourri and aged parchment. Unauthorized parking on the roadway. That's a breach of Statute 7 Clause D. She picked up her cordless phone, her index finger hovering over the speed dial for the private tow service. But she hesitated. A woman emerged from the driver's seat of the moving van. She was imposing, African-American, and commanded the area around her with an intrinsic authority that instantly rankled Eleanor. The woman wore a simple blouse and chinos, but she moved with the discipline of an officer, directing the offloading process. Then the young men appeared, identical twin brothers. They looked to be around 18, towering over their mother, with identical athletic builds that suggested university sports and identical closely cropped fades that Eleanor immediately categorized as affiliated with street gangs in her mental file. They were chuckling, carrying dense cartons as if they were filled with air. One of them, Eleanor would later discover this was Julian, spun a football on his finger while carrying a floor lamp in the other hand. "Ruffians," Eleanor hissed. "Marvelous, just marvelous. There goes the valuation of the neighborhood." She grabbed her specialized field glasses, a Zeiss Terra she had purchased explicitly for gazing at constellations, but used solely for neighbor scrutiny, and focused on the license plate of the truck. She wrote it down in her embossed journal. November 8th, 10:15 a.m. New occupants at 14 Serenity Lane. Demographics urban, probable transient. Risk of decibel infraction imminent. For the remainder of the afternoon, Eleanor didn't stir from her position. She watched as they unloaded conventional furnishings, a Navy modular sofa, an immense curved screen television, which she noted was suspiciously costly, and countless boxes of literature. Around 3:07 p.m., the other twin, Devin, clear's throat, sprinted across the lawn to retrieve a scrap of bubble wrap that had drifted away. His athletic shoe touched the edge of Eleanor's defaultless fescue turf. Eleanor gasped. She slammed her teacup down, striding toward the front entrance. She flung it open, not bothering with a cardigan, despite the late autumn chill. "Pardon me," she shrieked, her voice slicing through the quiet tranquility of the suburb. Devin froze, the bubble wrap in his grasp. He looked up, a bewildered but courteous grin forming on his face. "Yes, ma'am. Did something fall?" "You." She pointed a meticulously manicured finger at his foot. "You are encroaching. That boundary line terminates precisely 4 inches from the irrigation head. You are currently situated on private territory." Devin looked down at his sneaker, which was barely grazing her lawn. He stepped back onto his own paved drive, raising his hands. "My apologies. Just retrieving the packaging. Didn't intend to trespass." "I am not concerned with your intentions," Eleanor snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I am concerned with the regulations. This is not the metropolis. We uphold standards here. We maintain decorum. If you individuals cannot respect boundaries, you will not endure a calendar month." The mother, who had been deep inside the truck, stepped out onto the ramp. She didn't shout. She didn't appear enraged. She just gazed at Eleanor. It was a look of such composed, terrifying evaluation that Eleanor felt a shiver trace down her spine. Clear's throat. The woman adjusted her reading glasses, stared for 4 seconds, and then turned back to her son. "Devon," the mother said, her voice smooth and authoritative, "fetch the remaining crates. We do not have capacity for distractions." "Understood, Mom," Devon said, turning his back on Eleanor. Eleanor stood there seething. She had been dismissed, disregarded in her own cul-de-sac. "Distraction?" Eleanor whispered, her face flushing crimson. "Oh, you are profoundly mistaken. I am not a distraction. I am the adjudicator, the prosecution, and the executioner of this thoroughfare." She went back inside and slammed the door shut. She went directly to her private study, opened her laptop, and logged into the neighborhood social media platform. Estate Watch. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, identifying urgent notice, questionable activity at 14 Serenity Lane. New occupants aggressive when challenged about boundary infringement. Maintain your doors secured and your gates bolted. I suspect illicit trading based on the quality of the appliances and the absence of professional movers. Will provide further details. She hit post. Within moments, the approval reactions and worried replies from the other inhabitants, people like anxious Arthur Mills and rumor Rhonda Higgins, started flooding in. Eleanor smiled. The web was being woven. 2 weeks elapsed. To any conventional observer, the Jenkins family was the embodiment of propriety. The twins, Julian and Devon, departed the house at 7 a.m. sharp every morning with book bags, dressed immaculately for the exclusive academy nearby. They were observed jogging in the evenings, always acknowledging neighbors, even assisting elderly Miss Peabody carry her dry cleaning on a Thursday. But to Eleanor Sterling, their perfection was a facade. It was a strategy designed to weaken the neighborhood's vigilance. "They are excessively cordial," she confided to Rhonda Higgins over iced tea on her veranda. "It is a deliberate maneuver. They soothe you into a false sense of safety, and then bam, Clear's throat. You awaken, and your antique silverware is missing." "But Eleanor," Rhonda said, nervously stirring her herbal infusion, "Julian repaired my automatic gate yesterday without charge. He appears to be a respectable youth, and he's an honors student. I noticed his window decal." Eleanor slammed her spoon down. "Fabricated achievements, Rhonda. You can procure those decals on the internet. You are utterly gullible. That is precisely why I am the president, and you are the recording secretary." The breaking point for Eleanor commenced on a Friday afternoon. She was in her formal garden tending to her award-winning prize roses when she detected out it. Thump, thump, whoosh. She froze. She peered over the elaborate stone fence. In the rear yard of number 14, Julian and Devon were playing catch with a baseball. They had installed a portable pitcher's mound on their lawn. They were laughing, listening to tunes, classic 90s hip-hop, at a volume that was arguably moderate, but to Eleanor sounded like a declaration of war. She checked her wristwatch. 4:20 p.m. Technically, acoustic limitations didn't take effect until 10 o'clock p.m., but Eleanor Sterling did not adhere to municipal mandates. She adhered to Eleanor's edicts. She marched inside and retrieved her sound level meter. Yes, she owned a professional sound level meter. She stood at the edge of her property boundary, holding the instrument out like a religious artifact. It registered 67 dB, the volume of a standard dialogue. "Intolerable," she muttered. She marched over to their drive. The boys were in the middle of a passing drill. They were perspiring, concentrated, and clearly enjoying themselves. "Hello," Eleanor yelled. Julian caught the ball mid-toss and held it against his side. He wiped moisture from his forehead. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sterling. How was your day?" "Do not good afternoon me," she spat. "Terminate that subversive noise immediately and dismantle this eyesore. It transgresses the collective's aesthetic guidelines concerning recreational apparatus visibility." Devon stepped forward, looking drained. "Mrs. Sterling, we consulted the statutes. Temporary athletic equipment is permissible, provided it is not stored on the street overnight. And this is a tribe called Quest. Our mother appreciates this album." "I am indifferent to your mother's musical preferences," Eleanor sneered. "Where is she in any event?" Working a double shift at the laundromat? Or is she absent? She made air quotes with her fingers, suggesting incarceration. The ambiance shifted. The twins went rigid. Julian dropped the courteous demeanor. He took a step closer, his height suddenly very intimidating. Our mother, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, is at her vocation, a profession that necessitates significantly more deference than you are currently exhibiting. Is that a menace? Eleanor gasped, clutching her jade necklace instinctively. Did you just issue a threat to me? No, Devon interjected, placing a restraining hand on his brother's chest. He is merely stating that we are not violating any terms. We will reduce the volume by one level, fine, but we are permitted to practice on our own premises. We shall ascertain that, Eleanor said, retreating, her heart pounding with a synthesis of apprehension and excitement. She finally possessed ammunition. Confrontation, hostility, Clear's throat. She hastened back into her home and went straight to her archive room, a spare parlor filled with mahogany filing cabinets. She pulled the dossier for 14 Serenity Lane. She began to compose a formal infraction notice. Infraction 104, aggressive posture toward a board officer. Infraction 209, unsanctioned sonic disruption. Infraction 301, probable gang affiliation indicators. She printed the citation on stark emerald paper. But she didn't merely want to penalize them, she wanted them gone. She required leverage. That evening, Eleanor executed something she hadn't done in decades. She waited until 2:30 a.m. She donned dark clothing, she slipped out her rear exit and crawled through the towering box hedges separating their lots. She needed to examine their refuse. If she could discover proof of illegal substances or unapproved tenancy, she could initiate eviction proceedings. She reached the bins quietly, lifting the lid. It was empty. It was sanitation day tomorrow, but the bins were pristine. Excessively sterile. Who sanitizes their waste receptacles? She thought, paranoid. Someone concealing forensic evidence. Suddenly, a powerful security lamp snapped on, momentarily blinding her. But may I be of assistance, Ms. Sterling? She spun around, shielding her eyes. It was the mother. She was standing on the rear terrace, wearing a silk dressing gown, holding a glass of iced water. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't calling for law enforcement. She was simply observing. I, I detected a fox, Eleanor stammered, her heart accelerating. I was safeguarding the vicinity. In my refuse container? The woman inquired. Her voice was terrifyingly composed. Return home, Eleanor. Before you commit an act you cannot retract. Eleanor scrambled back through the hedge, snagging her cashmere top. She slammed her back door and double-locked it, inhaling heavily. She was trembling. Not from fright, but from fury. She presumes she can patronize me, Eleanor thought, pacing her polished marble kitchen. She presumes she owns this estate. I have powerful connections. I know the district marshal. I know the planning commissioner. Eleanor's eyes darted to the cellar door, a heavy reinforced iron portal with 3 deadbolts. A vulnerability she had maintained for 2 decades lay beyond that door. A vulnerability that made her feel omnipotent. If anyone discovered what was concealed beneath, Eleanor would face life imprisonment. But no one would discover it because she was the one who summoned the authorities, not the one apprehended. I must eliminate them before they eliminate me, she whispered. If she is awake at 2 a.m. and monitoring me, she possesses intelligence. She is conducting counter-surveillance on me. The paranoia flourished like a malignant bloom in her consciousness. The Jenkins family wasn't just a nuisance. They were an existential menace. The following morning, Eleanor initiated phase 2. She called her niece, Veronica. Veronica was a college dropout who worked as an attendant at the municipal courthouse, but she had access to restricted databases and a substantial resentment toward authority. Veronica, she instructed into the phone, I require you to run a registration number for me, and I need you to ascertain the employment location of a woman named Kendra Jenkins. I believe she is orchestrating a fraud. Clear's throat. And Eleanor, I cannot arbitrarily access private records, Veronica groaned. I will compensate you $750, she stated flatly. Transmit the information. 2 hours later, Veronica called back. Her voice was shaky. "Aunt Eleanor, you must sever all contact with these individuals." "Why?" she demanded. "Is she a convicted felon? Does she have pending indictments?" "I am prohibited from disclosing what I found," Veronica said. "But the data system, it is flagged. It is high priority clearance. You do not want to become involved with this." Eleanor ended the call. She interpreted this entirely differently. High priority clearance. That indicated federal protection program. That meant they were criminals who became informants. That meant they were exposed. Federal protection, she grinned, her teeth yellowed and predatory. Even more advantageous. One misstep, and the federal agents dragged them away. She looked out the window. Julian and Devin were meticulously cleaning their vehicle. A prestigious car, a vintage Triumph they were meticulously restoring. Stolen, she decided. Unquestionably stolen. Eleanor picked up the receiver. She wasn't calling the property collective board this time. She was dialing 911, Clear's throat. She was going to fabricate a scenario so persuasive the municipal police would have to deploy a tactical unit to the residence. She would claim she observed a firearm. She would claim she heard a shriek. She took a deep, calculated breath, channeled her inner dramatist, and pressed the call button. 911, what is your emergency? Please dispatch assistance immediately, Eleanor screamed into the phone, forcing manufactured tears from her eyes. There are two male individuals. They possess weapons. They are forcefully entering the residence next door at 14 Serenity Lane. I am certain they have murdered the resident. Oh, dear God, they are looking directly at me. Dispatch every available unit. She hung up and peered through the shutters, a distorted smile forming on her lips. Checkmate, she whispered. The silence following the 911 call was the most intense sound Eleanor had ever experienced. Her pulse hammered in her chest, a frantic chronometer counting down to either her triumph or her downfall. She rushed to her front window, positioning herself flawlessly in the shadow of her massive velvet drapery. She did not have to wait long. Within 4 minutes, the distant lament of sirens began to permeate the quiet suburban afternoon. This was not the sound of a standard patrol cruiser. This was a cacophony of flashing emergency lights in urgent wailing. 1 unit, 2, 3. An unmarked charcoal SUV moving with the velocity and accuracy of a military vehicle was the first to screech to a halt directly in front of 14 Serenity Lane. Several patrol cars followed, obstructing both entrances to the cul-de-sac. Excellent, Eleanor breathed, observing the pandemonium unfold. They perceived the threat as genuine. Officers spilled out of their vehicles. They were outfitted in full tactical attire, Kevlar vests, helmets, and carrying automatic rifles. They moved silently, utilizing the neighbors' parked vehicles for concealment, their expressions severe and concentrated. This was not a domestic disturbance. This was a high-risk apprehension maneuver. Julian and Devin, who had been meticulously polishing their Triumph, froze, their hands suddenly still on the electric buffer. They looked at the officers descending on their home, their expressions transitioning from perplexity to profound shock, and then immediately to practiced situational awareness. Hands raised, down on the pavement immediately, an officer with a bullhorn bellowed. 14 Serenity Lane. Hands where we can observe them. Compliance required instantly. Julian and Devin immediately released the buffer and the hose. They raised their hands above their heads. They looked utterly bewildered, but they executed the command perfectly, dropping to their knees on their own paved drive. Someone contacted 911 and reported armed individuals breaking in. An officer yelled at them, his rifle aimed precisely at Julian's torso. Who is inside the residence? No one, officer, Devin yelled back, his voice strained. It is only us. We reside here. We were cleaning our vehicle. Eleanor watched, a malevolent, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. This was superior to what she had envisioned. Humiliation, public exposure. The twins looked so youthful, so terrified, kneeling on the asphalt with assault weapons directed at them. The neighbors, Rhonda, Arthur, even elderly Ms. Peabody, were peeking out their windows, witnessing the spectacle. Suddenly, from the unmarked charcoal SUV, a figure emerged. It was a man flawlessly dressed in a bespoke suit, but with the bearing of a former college athlete. He looked like the primary investigator or a commanding officer. He assessed the scenario, then pivoted, holding the door open for his passenger. The passenger stepped out. It was a woman. She was dressed in an impeccable dark navy suit. She possessed the same tall, authoritative stature as Kendra Jenkins, the mother, but her composure was different. It was official, utterly commanding. She had closely cropped hair threaded with silver, and she adjusted the large silver insignia pinned to her lapel. The insignia caught the sunlight and flashed. It was far too large for a standard detective's badge. Eleanor leaned closer to the window, straining her eyes. Wait, no, that cannot be. The suit-wearing figure walked straight past the officers who had their weapons drawn. The officers saw her and instantly lowered their firearms, their faces snapping to attention. The lead officer, the one with the bullhorn, immediately brought his hand up in a crisp salute. The woman did not acknowledge the salute. She walked directly toward the two boys kneeling on the ground. Julian, Devin. Her voice was low, resonant, and carried an undeniable, inherent power. The boys looked up at her, their face etched with relief. Mom, what? Julian exclaimed, struggling to rise to his feet. Remain kneeling, son, the woman commanded gently. She then directed her attention to the police force. She did not raise her voice. She did not even elevate her voice above a firm conversational pitch. Who authorized this level of mobilization? And who is the reporting individual? She demanded, gazing around at the assembled personnel. The lead officer, Sergeant Ramirez, swallowed hard. Commissioner Jenkins, the call was dispatched as an armed home invasion in progress. We were required to roll out a Code 3 response. Eleanor Sterling felt the blood drain from her face. Her grip on the curtain slackened. Commissioner Jenkins. Commissioner. Kendra Jenkins was the new Commissioner of Public Safety for the entire metropolitan region. The high-priority clearance flag her niece mentioned wasn't witness protection. It was the highest echelon of law enforcement access. The woman, Kendra Jenkins, knelt down in front of your sons. She scrutinized them for injury, then stood up, her eyes hard and cold. She was silent for a moment, allowing the gravity of the realization to hang in the air. She was a black woman, an authority figure, standing over her twin black sons, who had just been held at gunpoint in their own drive based on a malicious, false allegation. She turned to Sergeant Ramirez. Secure the perimeter, Sergeant. Locate the reporting individual. I require a full deposition and an immediate, comprehensive internal review of this operation, beginning with the 911 audio recording. Then Commissioner Jenkins's eyes swept the cul-de-sac. They did not pause on Rhonda's home or Ms. Peabody's. They stopped and locked directly onto the front window of 12 Serenity Lane, Eleanor's window. Eleanor gasped and fell backward, stumbling away from the curtain, hitting the wall behind her. She had been detected. She knows I placed the call. The front door of 12 Serenity Lane burst open 20 minutes later. Eleanor had been frantically tearing up the emerald citation she had drafted earlier, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't shred the paper into sufficiently small fragments. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling. It was Sergeant Ramirez. He was no longer the intimidating, tactical officer. He was merely a man performing a highly awkward duty. Beside him stood the lead detective, a stocky, serious woman named Detective Owens. Yes, Eleanor squeaked, attempting to recover her composure, smoothing down her costly cashmere cardigan. Thank goodness you've arrived. I informed that emergency dispatcher. Did you apprehend them? Did you locate the intruders? Sergeant Ramirez looked pointedly at the pieces of emerald paper scattered on her hardwood floor. Ma'am, we have secured the scene. There were no intruders. There were only Commissioner Jenkins' sons who were cleaning their vehicle. Eleanor's face flushed. She reverted to immediate denial. Nonsense, I witnessed them. Two immense men. They appeared highly suspicious. I have been monitoring that residence since their arrival. I possess documentation of questionable behavior. They were planning a scheme. We have the 911 recording, ma'am, Detective Owens stated calmly, pulling out a small notepad. You reported armed men breaking in and claimed you heard a scream and that they were observing you. They were, Eleanor insisted, pointing wildly at the window. They perpetually observe me. They are aware I am watching. That is why they exhibited aggression. They were attempting to silence me. This is targeted persecution against a property collective president who is merely endeavoring to maintain order. Detective Owens disregarded her hysteria. Commissioner Jenkins's sons were not inside the house. They were in the driveway. No scream was heard by any other witness. And most crucially, Commissioner Jenkins's sons were held at gunpoint for 12 minutes based on your communication. The gravity of her words finally impacted Eleanor. She hadn't merely filed a trivial grievance. She had placed the children of the highest-ranking law enforcement official in mortal peril. I, I made an error, Eleanor whispered, suddenly shrinking. I was disoriented. The illumination was inadequate. Mrs. Sterling, Detective Owens said, her voice dropping to a serious, cold tone, we consider the submission of a false police report, particularly one that jeopardizes the lives of minors and police officers, to be an extremely serious felony. You have put the entire community at risk. Suddenly, the front door opened again. It was Commissioner Kendra Jenkins. She stood in the doorway, framed by the afternoon sun, wearing her impeccable uniform, now completed with the cap. She looked like justice incarnate, severe and uncompromising. Clears throat. Sergeant Ramirez, Detective Owens. Thank you, I will proceed from here. The two officers exchanged a glance of profound relief and quickly excused themselves, shutting the door behind them. Eleanor was now cornered in her own living room with the most powerful person in the city whose sons she had just attempted to endanger. Kendra, Eleanor stammered, attempting to sound friendly, I am profoundly apologetic. It was a simple misinterpretation. I presumed you leased this residence to a different caliber of individual. Commissioner Jenkins did not move. She simply looked at Eleanor, her eyes surveying the room, taking in the pristine, cold furnishings, the silk, the costly props of upper-class privilege. I did not lease this house, Eleanor, Commissioner Jenkins said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate pitch. I purchased it. I own it. And before you attempt to utilize the property collective bylaws against me, I have already thoroughly reviewed them. I found at least 21 instances where you selectively enforced regulations, costing the property owners of this street thousands in punitive assessments and legal expenses. Eleanor paled. That is slander. I am the president. You were the president, Commissioner Jenkins corrected. As of 3 hours ago, every neighbor you have ever antagonized, including Rhonda and Miss Peabody, submitted signed affidavits demanding your immediate dismissal and a comprehensive fiscal audit of the collective. I believe your trivial reign is concluded. But Eleanor, a tyrant to the core, grasped onto one last fragment of hope. You cannot execute this. You are abusing your governmental position. This is retribution, Eleanor yelled. You are attempting to demolish me simply because I am safeguarding my community from your kind. You cannot investigate me. That is a conflict of interest. I will contact the state prosecutor. Commissioner Jenkins walked slowly, deliberately toward Eleanor. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of the bully, looking down at her. Contact the state prosecutor, Eleanor, Commissioner Jenkins said, a perilous flicker in her eye. But before you do, you should be aware of this. I did not arrive here today as the Commissioner of Public Safety to arrest you for a fraudulent report. I came here, the homeowner of 14 Serenity Lane, to serve you with a legal document. She reached into her uniform jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a court summons. This is a civil action, Commissioner Jenkins explained, placing the document on the mahogany coffee table. It is for $7 million in damages, emotional trauma, libel, defamation, and reckless endangerment of my minor children. Your residence, your financial holdings, your retirement funds, they are all at risk, and I am going to prevail. She paused, allowing the weight of the enormous financial devastation to sink in. Clears throat. Then she leaned in, her voice now a chilling whisper. But that is merely the consequence of being a reprehensible neighbor, Eleanor. The consequence of being a reprehensible person is significantly worse. Commissioner Jenkins straightened up, her expression utterly emotionless. 22 years ago, on a desolate December night, I was a rookie patrol officer. I was dispatched to a scene involving a stolen sedan and a missing 16-year-old girl named Charlotte Davies. Eleanor's face turned ashen. All the color drained away, leaving her skin like porcelain. She looked toward the heavy iron cellar door at the rear of the living room. I recall that investigation. Commissioner Jenkins continued, her gaze following Eleanor's. The case turned cold. The body was never recovered. The conjecture was she eloped or was abducted by a random passerby. I am unaware of what you are referencing, Eleanor choked out, pressing herself against the wall. I know you are not, Eleanor, Chief Jenkins said, pulling out her mobile phone. But I have been conducting my own inquiry since the day I relocated next door. A law enforcement officer develops the ability to read individuals, Eleanor, and a commissioner has access to resources you cannot fathom. She held up the phone. On the screen was a detailed high-resolution thermal image of Eleanor's residence. The image showed a single concentrated, extremely hot zone in the foundation of the house, directly beneath the cellar. When you construct a concrete barrier around a recent burial site, Commissioner Jenkins explained softly, the decomposition process generates an immense amount of residual thermal energy. Even 20 years later, in the cold, a thermal scan registers it like a furnace. Detective Owens and Sergeant Ramirez are currently securing a warrant for a comprehensive property search, not for a fraudulent police report, but for capital murder. I knew you were culpable of something the instant I saw your face that very first day, Eleanor. I merely needed you to be arrogant enough to provide me with the pretext to investigate further. My boys were a lure, Eleanor, and you took the bait. Eleanor Sterling sank to the floor, paralyzed. The knock on her front door was firm and definitive. The search warrant had arrived. The warrant was executed with the precision of a surgical strike, but with the violence of a complete demolition. Eleanor Sterling sat on her velvet-tufted ottoman in the center of her living room, a uniformed officer standing guard by the entrance. She was not in restraints yet. Commissioner Jenkins wanted her to observe. The commissioner wanted Eleanor to witness the systematic deconstruction of her sanctuary. You cannot do this, Eleanor mumbled, rocking back and forth. My prize roses. You are crushing my roses. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed. What was once a quiet cul-de-sac was now a staging area for the Metro Forensics Unit. The news vehicles had arrived. Channel 5, Channel 9, even a national syndicate. The headline was irresistible. Suburban HOA president accused of fraudulent reporting. Police commissioner uncovers decades-old cold case. Rhonda Higgins stood on her porch, clutching her robe, watching as officers carried out box after box of Eleanor's property collective files, the illegal surveillance she had maintained on neighbors for years. She documented the time I placed my rubbish out, Rhonda whispered to Arthur Mills, who was shaking his head in disbelief. She documented that my cat was overweight and unseemly. She is a fiend. Inside 12 Serenity Lane, the sound of a pneumatic drill shattered the silence. Eleanor flinched with every impact. They were in the cellar. They were penetrating the concrete floor of the storage vault. The room she had kept sealed for 22 years. The room she told everyone was for sensitive archival documents. Down in the cellar, the air was dense with concrete dust. Detective Owens wore a protective mask, observing as the forensic anthropology team worked. The thermal scan Commissioner Jenkins had displayed for Eleanor wasn't a deception. There was a cavity beneath the slab, a perturbation in the earth that nature hadn't placed there. Commissioner Jenkins walked down the stairs. She had removed her dress coat, rolling up the sleeves of her white uniform blouse. She needed to witness this herself. She remembered Charlotte Davies. She remembered the missing person poster, a girl with bright eyes and a drama club pin. Charlotte had been a pet sitter for a family down the street in the old neighborhood. She had vanished while walking home. The speculation was she ran away with a sweetheart, but Kendra Jenkins, back then a rookie officer, had interviewed a witness who said Charlotte was last seen arguing with an affluent woman in a Maserati. Eleanor drove a Maserati. A commissioner, Detective Owens said, her voice muffled by the mask. She pointed to the aperture in the floor. We detected something. It's not just soil. We found fabric. Denim. Commissioner Jenkins closed her eyes for a brief moment, offering a silent invocation for the girl who never returned home. Proceed with caution, Owens. I want every thread cataloged. This is a homicide scene now. Back upstairs, the noise ceased. The silence was more oppressive. Eleanor looked up at the officer guarding her. Why did they halt? Did they find, did they find nothing? The officer didn't respond. He just looked at her with pure disdain. 10 minutes later, Commissioner Jenkins ascended the stairs. She held a plastic evidence bag in her hand. Inside was a small, tarnished object, a pendant. She walked over to Eleanor and held the bag aloft. "Do you recognize this?" Jenkins asked softly. Eleanor stared at the pendant. Her breath hitched. She recalled yanking it off the girl's neck during the altercation. She thought she had tossed it in the reservoir, but in her hysteria, she must have dropped it in the hole before the concrete was poured. "It contains initials inside," Jenkins said. "CD, Charlotte Davies." Eleanor began to hyperventilate. She was intruding, just like your sons. She walked across my meticulously maintained lawn. She laughed at me. I instructed her to vacate, and she laughed. She claimed I was a melancholy, isolated old crone. I only intended to frighten her. I pushed her. She tumbled down the steps. And instead of contacting emergency medical services, Jenkins finished, her voice like honed steel, you contacted a cement contractor. You buried a minor to protect your reputation. Commissioner Jenkins nodded to the officer. "Cuff her." The officer grabbed Eleanor's wrists, twisting them behind her back. The sharp click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. "Eleanor Sterling," Commissioner Jenkins announced, reciting the Miranda warnings from memory. "You are under arrest for the murder of Charlotte Davies, filing a fraudulent police report, and reckless endangerment. You retain the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you to commence utilizing it." They escorted her out the front door. The instant Eleanor stepped onto her porch, the flashbulbs erupted. It was blinding. The entire neighborhood was present. The people she had terrorized, penalized, and bullied for 18 years were observing her catastrophic demise. She saw Devin and Julian standing by their triumph. They weren't enraged. They just looked somber. They looked at her with pity. That hurt more than any anger. She was the Empress of Whispering Pines, and now she was simply a pathetic old woman in handcuffs. "Remove her from this location," Commissioner Jenkins ordered. As they pushed Eleanor into the back of the patrol cruiser, she saw one last sight, Clear's throat. Rhonda Higgins walked over to Eleanor's pristine, award-winning flower bed, the one Eleanor had called animal control on a neighbor's beloved dog over last year for digging in. Rhonda reached down, grabbed a clump of prize roses, and ripped them out by the roots. She tossed them onto the sidewalk. The patrol car doors slammed shut. The downfall of Eleanor Sterling was rapid, merciless, in public. Because of Commissioner Jenkins' direct involvement, the state prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Elaine Vance, took the case personally. There was no plea agreement offered. The evidence was irrefutable. The body beneath the floor, the pendant, the spontaneous admission captured on the police body camera in the living room. The trial lasted 5 weeks. It was the most highly rated broadcast on cable legal news. The nation watched as the property collective nightmare was exposed. Witnesses testified about her extreme cruelty, how she fined a family for having a holiday ornament displayed 1 hour past the cutoff date, how she poisoned a neighbor's prize oak tree because it cast a shadow on her sun deck. But the murder of Charlotte Davies was the undeniable final evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Eleanor to life in prison without any possibility of parole, plus 30 years for the fraudulent reporting and endangerment charges. But the cosmic retribution didn't conclude at the penitentiary gate. Commissioner Jenkins's civil lawsuit for $7 million was successful. Eleanor's assets were frozen and liquidated. 12 Serenity Lane, her pride and joy, was seized. In a twist of poetic justice that the neighborhood savored, the house wasn't sold to another affluent perfectionist. It was acquired by the municipal government at auction, using the funds from Eleanor's own seized accounts, and converted into the Charlotte Davies Youth Outreach Center. The walls were painted bright, vibrant hues. A basketball court was installed in the driveway permanently. Teenagers, the very demographic Eleanor despised, inundated the property daily. They played music. They laughed. They rode scooters on the smooth concrete of the drive. Every day, the oppressive ghosts of Eleanor's enforced order were dispelled by the sheer, unadulterated joy of the youth she had loathed. Eleanor Sterling, now inmate number 8994 cells 2, was transferred to the Oak Creek Correctional Facility. It was a maximum security institution. There were no silk drapes here. There were no prize roses. She was placed in general population. On her first day in the mess hall, Eleanor walked with her tray, nose elevated, attempting to maintain some semblance of her former dignity. She sat at an unoccupied table, meticulously dusting off the seat before sitting down. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. A large, formidable woman with elaborate tattoos covering her arms stood there. She was holding a tray. "That is my designated seating area," the woman said. "There is no assigned seating stipulated in the inmate manual," Eleanor snapped, reverting to her old instincts. "I examined the regulations." The mess hall went silent. The woman smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You must be the collective lady, the one who contacted the police on the commissioner's offspring." Patricia stiffened. "I was preserving decorum." "Indeed." The woman sat down opposite her, leaning in close. "I am the block overseer here, somewhat analogous to a property collective president, but for this cell block, and we have our own mandates too." The woman reached over and took Eleanor's dessert, a dry piece of cake. "Mandate number 1, you remit tribute to the leadership." Eleanor watched her cake disappear. She looked around for a supervisor, for a guard, for anyone, but the correctional officers were looking the opposite direction. She was isolated. She had spent her entire existence using rules to inflict pain, using authority to crush those weaker than her. Now she was in a world where the rules were brutal, and she was the most vulnerable link. The ultimate unexpected development. 6 months later, Eleanor received a piece of correspondence. It was the only item of mail she had ever received. She opened it with trembling hands. It was a glossy photograph. It was a picture of the new Whispering Pines annual community barbecue. A banner hung across the street, "Whispering Pines Unity Day." In the center of the photo, operating the grill, was Commissioner Kendra Jenkins. She was laughing, holding a spatula. Next to her were Julian and Devin, now taller, looking exceptionally happy, and sitting in lawn chairs, clinking glasses of iced tea, were Rhonda Higgins, Arthur Mills, and elderly Ms. Peabody. They were all smiling. They looked relaxed. The perfectly manicured oppression of Eleanor's reign was utterly gone. The grass was a little shaggy. There were children's toys on the sidewalks. It looked messy. It looked vibrant. On the reverse of the photograph was a note in elegant handwriting. "Eleanor, the boys are thriving. Devin was accepted to Yale. Julian is captain of the debate team, clears throat. We utilized the settlement funds to establish a scholarship in Charlotte's name. The neighborhood is finally secure. Not because of your rules, but because the individual who was truly dangerous is finally incarcerated. Enjoy your new neighborhood. Commissioner Jenkins." Eleanor stared at the photograph. A single tear rolled down her cheek, landing on the cold, gray floor of her cell. The lights flickered and went out. It was 9 o'clock p.m. Lights out. She lay in the darkness, listening to the shouting and banging of the other inmates, finally grasping the true meaning of a noise violation she could never, ever report. The transition from the manicured emerald green lawns of Whispering Pines to the gray industrial concrete of the Oak Creek Correctional Facility was a shock that Eleanor Sterling's system had yet to process. Even 12 months later, Eleanor, now known only as Inmate 189, sat at a scratched metal table in the common area. The air here was different. It didn't smell of jasmine and fresh mulch. It smelled of industrial bleach, boiled cabbage, and absolute despair. She smoothed the front of her orange jumpsuit, a nervous tick she couldn't shake. In her mind, she was smoothing out a wrinkle in a silk blouse, preparing to address the Property Collective Board. But when she looked down, the bright orange fabric mocked her. She had spent 40 years curating a life of absolute control. She controlled the weeds in her garden. She controlled the paint colors of her neighbor's shutters. She controlled the narrative. Now she couldn't even control the temperature of her room or the time she ate dinner. "Hey, Duchess," a voice rasped from the table behind her. Eleanor stiffened. It was Vega, a woman serving 15 years for armed robbery. Vega had taken a distinct dislike to Eleanor's habit of correcting other inmates' grammar. "You going to consume that biscuit or just inspect it for imperfections?" Vega sneered. Eleanor didn't turn around. "I am merely assessing its nutritional content, or lack thereof." "Toss it over here," Vega commanded. In the old days, Eleanor would have called the police. She would have written a citation. Now she simply slid the dry roll across the table without making eye contact. This was her new hierarchy. She was at the very bottom, and the silence she had always craved was now her greatest adversary. 200 yards away, the sun was setting over 14 Serenity Lane, bathing the cul-de-sac in a warm golden light. But the silence Eleanor had enforced with an iron fist was gone. The street was alive. It was the one-year anniversary of the property collective scandal, as the local papers called it. But the residents of Whispering Pines weren't marking it with solemnity. They were celebrating a renaissance. The house at 12 Serenity Lane, Eleanor's fortress, had undergone a radical transformation. The imposing prison gray siding had been stripped away, replaced by a welcoming, soft, butter yellow clapboard. The towering privacy hedges, which had stood like sentinels blocking the view of the street, had been ripped out by the roots. In their place sat a wide, inviting wraparound porch filled with rocking chairs. Above the front door, a new sign had been mounted. It was hand-carved from reclaimed oak, polished to a shine. The Charlotte Davies Community Center. Commissioner Kendra Jenkins stood on that porch, looking out at the sea of faces. She wasn't wearing her commissioner's uniform today. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair loose. She looked younger, lighter, as if the exorcism of the house next door had lifted a physical weight from her shoulders. To her left stood Julian and Devin. The twins had changed too. The boys who had been forced to kneel at gunpoint on the asphalt were now young men standing tall. Julian wore a Georgetown University hoodie. Devin was sketching on a drafting pad, already planning an expansion for the community garden. "Friends, neighbors," Olivia's voice rang out, amplified not by a bullhorn, but by the natural acoustics of a street, no longer afraid to make noise. The crowd quieted down. It was a diverse crowd now. There were kids on skateboards, elderly couples holding hands, and teenagers of every background mingling on the lawn. "A year ago, this house was a sepulcher," Kendra began, gesturing to the yellow building behind her. "It was a monument to suspicion. It was a place where secrets were buried under concrete and where prejudice was disguised as property value. The woman who lived here believed that a neighborhood is defined by its fences." Kendra paused, her eyes finding Charlotte Davies' parents in the front row. They were holding a framed photo of their daughter, tears streaming down their faces, not of pain, but of peace. "But we know the truth," Kendra continued, her voice gaining strength. "A neighborhood is defined by its bridges. When we seized this property, the city asked me what I wanted to do with it. They suggested selling it to the highest bidder. I said no." She smiled, looking at her sons. "We used the assets seized from Eleanor Sterling, every single dollar of her stocks, her savings, her pension, to build this, a center for at-risk youth, a place where kids can play music as loud as they want, a place where they can learn, safe from judgment. Eleanor wanted to keep those people out, so we decided to invite everyone in." The applause that erupted was deafening. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was a roar of victory. Rhonda Higgins, once Eleanor's terrified subordinate, was blowing a celebratory horn. Arthur Mills was popping champagne. Back at Oak Creek Correctional, the lights in the recreation room flickered. It was 6 p.m. news hour. The inmates gathered around the single wall-mounted television encased in protective plexiglass. Eleanor sat in the back corner trying to read a book, but the volume was turned up too high. "Yo, Duchess, look!" Vega shouted, pointing a tattooed finger at the screen. "Isn't that your castle?" Eleanor looked up and her blood ran cold. On the screen was a live aerial shot of 12 Serenity Lane, but it looked wrong. It was colorful. There were children running on her prize-winning zoysia grass. There was a bouncy castle in her driveway. The news anchor's voice cut through the static of the prison common room. "A stunning turn of events in Whispering Pines today. The former home of disgraced property collective president Eleanor Sterling has officially reopened as the Charlotte Davies Youth Center. In a twist of poetic justice, the center was fully funded by the liquidation of Sterling's entire estate." Eleanor felt the book slip from her fingers. Her money, her carefully hoarded retirement, her legacy. It was all gone. The camera cut to a close-up of Julian Jenkins. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes bright and intelligent. The reporter asked him, "Julian, do you harbor any resentment toward the woman who tried to have you arrested?" The room in the prison went silent. Even Vega stopped chewing her gum, her throat. Julian smiled. It wasn't a smile of malice. It was a smile of absolute, untouchable victory. "Honestly," Julian said, his voice smooth and calm, "I want to thank her. If she hadn't been so hateful, if she hadn't called the police that day, we never would have found Charlotte. We never would have united this neighborhood. Eleanor Sterling tried to destroy us, but instead she gave us the funding to save hundreds of kids just like us. So thank you, Eleanor. You finally did something good for the community. You paid for it." The reporter laughed. "Well said. And there you have it. Justice served with a smile." The screen faded to a commercial for car insurance. For a moment, the recreation room was deadly silent. Then a single laugh rang out. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was roaring with laughter. "She paid for it," Vega cackled, slapping her knee. "You hear that, Duchess? You're a donor. You're a philanthropist. They got a bouncy castle on your driveway, Patty." Another inmate yelled, "Bet that violates a zoning ordinance." Eleanor couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. The humiliation was total. She wasn't just in prison. She was a joke. The boys she viewed as thugs were flourishing on her dime, living in her house, laughing on her lawn. She had tried to erase them, but she had only succeeded in erasing herself. She stood up trembling, her face a mask of crumbling arrogance. "Turn it off," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That is my property. I forbid this. I am the president of the—" "You ain't nothing but a number, Van Doren," a guard shouted from the catwalk. "Sit down and shut up." Eleanor sank back into her metal chair. She looked at the blank gray wall in front of her. She closed her eyes, but she could still see the image of the yellow house, bright and alive, mocking her from the screen. She realized then that she would die in this cage, and when she did, no one would mourn. The world outside had already moved on, louder and happier than it had ever been without her. The silence she had demanded for so long had finally arrived. It was cold, it was empty, and it was hers alone. The story of Eleanor Sterling is a chilling reminder that the walls we build to keep others out eventually become the walls that keep us in. Here's throat. She believed her status, her wealth, and her knowledge of the rules made her invincible. Clears throat. She thought she could weaponize the police against the family just because they didn't look like her. But she made a fatal calculation. She underestimated the power of a mother's love, and she underestimated the inevitable swing of the pendulum of justice. In the end, Eleanor got exactly what she wanted, a gated community where everyone follows the rules. It's just called a penitentiary. Meanwhile, the community she tried to divide is stronger than ever, proving that the best revenge isn't violence. It's thriving. It's living your best life while your hater watches from a distance, powerless to stop the joy. If this story of ultimate karma gave you chills, do me a huge favor. One, smash that like button. Let's get this video to 50,000 likes. I want the algorithm to push this story to every Karen on the internet so they know what happens when you mess with the wrong family. 2, subscribe and ring the bell. I upload high-drama stories of justice and revenge every single week on Ebon Stories. You do not want to miss the next one. It involves a lottery ticket and a cheating spouse. 3, comment below. What was the most satisfying part for you? Was it the commissioner revealing her badge? Or was it Julian thanking Eleanor on national TV? Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. Treat your neighbors with respect, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.